Okay, so it is the end of the academic year at the time of recording. And what I want to do in this episode is give some of my reflections and observations relating to some of the things that I've seen, I've worked with, and ultimately, I suppose, as well, some suggestions about what we can do moving into the forthcoming academic year. Which, if you're an educator watching this, you might be going, hey, man, hey, we just finished. Like, give us a sec to just like chill. And I'm here, trust me, your job and what you do is super intense. And so if you want to park this episode for maybe a few weeks out before you return, no problem. I understand. I get it. But for me, this is quite fresh in my mind. And I want to just do an episode now, which kind of speaks to some of the things that, like I say, I've seen and I've observed as someone that goes around the UK, visiting a range of different schools, working with a range of different young people around topic areas such as masculinities, misogyny, sexism, and the sort of themes that I see emerging in the delivery style and delivery stuff that I do with mostly young men and boys in the context of education. Now, I want to be really clear before I jump into this episode what my posture is before we jump into some of my observations. If you are new here, these episodes are my perspectives, not the perspective. And it's very easy in spaces like this that I work within and that I work adjacent to hear people talk about what they do in relation to the work and view it as the perspective because it comes from an expert position. I want to be really clear and really intentional. These are some of the things that I have personally observed, which means that this is not a blanket statement that therefore applies to every school context in the UK or outside of the UK. I want to be really intentional with that because one of the things that personally frustrates me as both a human being and a human doing this work is the blanketization, the generalization that often doesn't make space or room for the nuance that's necessary and the plurality that's really, present in the work that we do. When we're working with masculinities, young men, young people in general, there are so many different cultural contexts, cultural touch points, intersectional experiences. And if you haven't heard of intersectionality, we're talking about the ways in which things like class, race, gendered experience, sexuality, neurodiversity all intersect to produce individual and at times, totally different experiences in the cultures and communities that we exist within. And so I'm not trying to make this episode from the perspective of this is what it's like everywhere else. I'm just sharing this because I see a lot of commentary. I see a lot of people sharing opinions and ideas about what schools need and what schools are missing, which I understand and I get. But I also see a lot of moral panics around, okay, what's actually going on in schools? What's happening? Is it really as bad as things are, we're making out? And is it worse? Like what's going on? What's happening? So just to be clear, my perspective, not the perspective, my observations, not the observations. And this episode is really just sharing some themes that I think are really important for us to consider as educators and as people who work with young people. Moving into the next phases of our work, whenever that is, whenever you are tapping into this episode. And so for me, I think what's really interesting to start with is the observation that I've kind of been, making, or the themes rather that's been emerging over the last couple of years, which is this. Generally speaking, as a general rule of thumb in the work that I do, young men, boys are generally a lot more receptive, curious, and introspective when it comes to exploring and examining ideas of masculinity. There's often this, I don't want to say a moral panic, but there's often this cultural assumption that when you go in as an external visitor or somebody that works in schools or works adjacent to schools or in any educational capacity, that when you talk about things like masculinity, misogyny, sexism, etc., you're entering into, the dragon's den, for lack of a better term, when you're just there to get flamed out. Whilst there is elements of that which can be true, insofar as there is a resistance at times, there is a defensiveness at times. What I have generally observed in my work as a man in the space is that there is a general reflectiveness and a curiosity and a desire to explore and examine ideas of masculinity that are often taken for granted. One of the things or phrases that I've heard the most this past year, academic year, is, correct me if I'm wrong on this, or from my perspective, it feels like, but I'm not sure. I don't know if that's right. There is a recognition that their perspective isn't the perspective, and that there is a genuine curiosity to explore and examine ideas that relate to masculinity. Now, there is a slight um, point that needs to be made specifically around the nuance of the dynamics that I'm involved with and I'm a part of. Okay. Because I recognize if you're watching the audio or listen to the audio or watching the video, if you are watching the video, you will see that I am, mask presenting. I am a man. I am a man that works in space. And there's often a reflection that's shared, to me by educators and practitioners in the space, which I think is really valid, which is at times there is a greater chance or likelihood of what you're saying and what you're facilitating with boys and young men being received more positively just because you're a man existing in those spaces. And whilst I'm often quite critical of the fact that I think that young men and masculinities need proximity to a range of different inputs, worldviews, and perspectives. Men and boys don't just learn about masculinity from men and masculinities. We can learn about masculinity from anyone. I do recognize that there is a cultural conditioning that at times views a person who presents as a masculinity in the space as more authoritative. And there is a certain privilege to me being a man and an external visitor that often does create that sense of perhaps more of a curiosity and a more openness and receptiveness. There's a social desirability at play, for lack of a better term. And I want to name that because I think that's really important in terms of unpacking and looking deep into the soil of some of the presenting contexts that I work alongside. What I am seeing from my lens is a general appetite for exploring and examining ideas of masculinity, and teachers and educators in the context that I've worked within and alongside are also reporting at points that increased appetite to explore and reflect. What that means moving forward is that for me, there needs to be more space for that curious reflection. You can't teach this is masculinity or this is what masculinity is and this is what we should be thinking about. My approach and my posture has always been we need to show young men, young people by extension, how to think, not what to think. And that posture of showing people how to think is a critical thinking posture. It takes time, it takes questioning, it takes curiosity, it takes pacing. All of which, if you're an educator listening to this, you might be saying something along the lines of, "Hey, Lewis, that sounds great. Can I have some of that?" Because we don't have any of that. We don't have the time. The resources are short. We don't have the space and capacity to be able to facilitate that because we're engaging and seeing that so much in the context of the work that we're doing. When I hear it and I recognize it. For me, and I've said this in, other podcast formats and other interviews that I've been in over the last few months, there needs to be a shift and a change in the way in which we approach work with young people in this context, specifically young men and masculinities, because there is an appetite and that appetite can't be satiated or sort of fulfilled in one quick session. It's like, what do you think? Okay, cool. There needs to be a consistency. There needs to be a intentionality that creates room and space for that deep thinking work to be facilitated, that critical thinking to be facilitated, to look at ideas and examine them from a position of curiosity and, again, intentionality, as opposed to I'm defending my point of view because I've been told that this is terrible, wrong, etc. Something that I call tautology in this work. Don't get me twisted. Some of these ideas we do need to challenge directly and say that is not okay because, and this is not acceptable in the context of where you are now and the men that you're growing into. But creating space for slower, more intentional, more paced work for me is massively important because the appetite is there and the desire to curiously examine those ideas and belief systems are also there too, at least, as I said, from my perspective and my point of view. And so that's one of the first things that I see and, have really been aware of across the different spaces and places that I've visited across my work over the past academic year. And just so you're aware, these aren't the same cultural contexts. These are inner city schools. These are rural independent schools. These are schools that exist, in small towns. There's a range of different cultural and communal contexts where that appetite is present. And you could say, okay, there's probably this impact and influence from social media where there's sort of more of a sort of level conceptual ground for some of these ideas and appetite to be present. But I also think contextually we've been, in a cultural context or a wider cultural context where ideas around masculinity have been discussed and brought forward in a range of different ways, some fruitful, some not so fruitful, for coming up to about 5 years now, almost 5 years. And so there is a greater conceptual awareness at both the educational level and the communal level, which I think is beginning to feed in at times into that general appetite and that general kind of presentation. So that's the first thing that I'm observing in this work, which I think is really, important to name, especially if you're someone that's listening to this and thinking that, a lot of the work that's happening in schools, there's a general blanket of resistance and no one's interested in the work. From my experience, as I've said, that is there and it's present, and it's palpable. So that leads me on to the next point in this kind of what I'm observing and what I'm seeing, which I think is, again, really important to name. There is that desire and that appetite to explore and expand on ideas of masculinity. They often take it for granted. And what's really interesting is this real fascinating tension that I often observe in the work that I do, specifically in smaller workshop spaces, where you have that appetite that I've just mentioned in the previous point, and in the private space or the more private space of workshops, where you're kind of surfacing not just personal ideas, but also those personal reflections of the culture that exists around us. What you often see and hear in those spaces is things like sexism, misogyny. They're bad, they're terrible, they're not good, they're awful, right? There's this private condemning in, smaller groups where there's less eyes and, years listening, and there's this idea of like, no, this is wrong, and I'm not about it. I don't stand for it. And there's this general statement of, no, this doesn't run here, and I don't support it. But what's really fascinating to observe is the tension through which specifically misogyny and sexism are enacted through what some people call casual. And if you're an audio listener, I put that in inverted commas with my hands. Casual misogyny and sexism. Now, I've said this in previous episodes, but for me, there's no such thing as casual sexism and misogyny. They're all examples that cause harm and compound harm over time. But there's a real tension between I'm not sexist and misogynistic, I think that's terrible and I think it's bad, and also behaviors that actively perpetuate some of those things that they've just named that they don't mess with, that they're not in alignment with. For example, some behavioral trends that I've seen, and you may see as educators listening into this over the past academic year, which I think are really important to know. First and foremost, you've got young men, boys referring to their peers and their friends by their mother's first name. It's not naming each other by their first names, by their mother's first names. It's using language to talk about women and girls that are objectifying and dehumanizing. For example, and this is very culturally bespoke, so this might not be the language that you hear as educators in the spaces that you're a part of, but language such as ting, bop, beanie, jawn, taunt. These languages, it's the same language. These phrases, these terms that are used specifically to talk about women and girls that are dehumanizing and objectifying, but also, and this is important, culturally encouraged and normalized. There's no resistance. There's no question of, wait, why are we using that? Until you mention it and challenge it yourself. It's very accepted and it's very normalized in the cultural context that I've worked within and observed. But then there's also this general resistance when challenged about harmful behavior that feels not that deep. There's a not that deepness to challenge when that tension is named that I think is really important to talk about as well. No, we're joking. We're friends. We get it. We know it's not that, harmful. We're okay with it because we know we're not being serious by it. There's this real need to dive in as a culture across schools, for my opinion, of making space and time to acknowledge the everydayness of sexism and misogyny. Those examples that I've just given you are some examples of that. It's a part of the culture. It's not really checked in on as much as maybe some of for what some people call the more overt stuff, more, hands-on, for lack of a better term, harm, because it is done casually. It's sometimes not detectable because it exists within peer groups. It's not challenged. And for me, this is where I see a lot of those compounding of harm happening. It's in the everydayness that we often bypass because it's not something that we've seen or conditioned to view as harmful or problematic, and it's present in how young people respond to challenge. I didn't mean that like that. It's just a joke. It's not that deep. It's just a bit of banter. When actually these aren't funny. It isn't banter because the classmates, the staff, peers are uncomfortable, they're dysregulated, they're activated, and they don't like that language being used. This need to make firstly, the naming of the tension, between this idea of, oh, actually, I'm against misogyny and sexism, and I'm actually actively upholding it as well, though, in some of the things that I think are funny or not that deep and not that big of a deal, needs to be brought front and center to the conversations when we're talking about the normalization and perpetuation of harm cultures, because there's often this avoidance or this excusing or this removal of self accountability in these conversations. I don't do that, so it doesn't apply to me. I don't think that, so therefore it doesn't apply to me. When actually there's an everydayness that needs to be really rooted into the conversation and really made space for, in terms of how we're critically examining how misogyny and sexism and harm cultures are normalized and encouraged through everyday activities and actions, for lack of a better term, but also that tension. You say that you're against it, but do you not realize that those things that you feel are funny are actually encouraging and normalizing those things that you're, supposedly against? It's naming that tension and creating that critical space to explore and examine it, which I think is really important in future work as we move into next academic year. And there's also some really interesting tensions on the subject of tension that I think are also really important to name. When you ask men and boys, specifically preteen and sort of young teens in the context of delivery, like, what do you think of when it comes to like being a man? How do you understand being a man, or what do you think being a man entails? This man box adjacent definition of masculine is incredibly palpable. It's incredibly present, and it's super pertinent across different cultural contexts. Being a man is about being physically strong. It's about being mentally strong and stoic. It's about being a protector. It's about being a provider. It's about not showing weakness. It's about being in this position of power and leadership. And these definitions of masculinity, or the things that we associate with masculinity, I've written about this on my Instagram and TikTok as well. They're seen as almost inherited gendered traits, as opposed to intentional, creative acts of construction. Let me explain what I mean by that. Masculinity is seen as something that, this is the formula. This is what I have to be seen as a man. And this rigid idea of masculinity, in some spaces known and referred to as the man box, is this rigid, this is what being a man entails. If you step outside of those confines, you're not man. You're not man enough. You're not masculine. It's very present in some of those definitions that young men and boys are bringing into spaces when discussing masculinity. Masculinity is not seen as a creative process. It's not seen as a personal process. It's not seen as something that is rooted to individuals and that there's individual variance and difference. It's often positioned and defined as a set of rules, a set of, this is what it means to be a man. This is what I have to enact and embody. On the previous episode that I did on why I use video games to kind of, talk about masculinity, delves a little bit into how I sort of approach masculinity from more of a creative process and how it lands with young people. But the point is this: we are still encountering a lot of rigid ideas of masculinity that are present within and across definitions of what it means to be a man. And this is really important. This isn't just from online influences, because often what we do is we go, oh, it's just the online space and sphere that feeding these ideas. And in some contexts, that is definitely an influence, in fact, that needs to be named and needs to be, approached sensitively, proactively, and curiously. But it's also in our communities. It's also in our inherited ideas of what it means to be a man, how masculinity is discussed or assumed in our community context, in our relational context with other men in our lives, like caregivers and family members and peers in our community. These are also modeling and embodying specific ideas of masculinity. It's not just the online sphere, it's the offline influences too that are impacting and influencing some of these ideas of what it means to be a man, or specifically how being a man is defined by young men and masculinities. So I want to make this known because I think there's still a lot of work to do around looking at the ideas of masculinity that aren't positioned from, this is what it means to be a man, from a position of rigidity, but making room to contact and explore plurality, like individual differences, the power and importance of variance when we're talking about what it means to be a man in the context of how we define masculinity to young people, but also, importantly, how we embody and model it ourselves as men in education and as men in the communities that we exist within as well. Massively important. That's something that I'm seeing a lot in the work that I do. On this sort of area of, ideas that are kind of rooted in, very specific, assumptions or times rigidity, there is also tension that is also present as well. You're beginning to see, right, there's a constant tension and friction between what I'm bringing into some of my observations, right? Because you've got this definition of being a man that's often quite rigid that is shared by young men and masculinities across the context of my delivery. But then you've also got a real awareness that actually being a man is also about being able to tell your friends that you love them, that you care for them, not being afraid to show emotion, not being afraid to be vulnerable with your peers and friends around you. Like there's this idea that that's absolutely acceptable as a man. And can you see the tension there? Because that's also shared in the space. But being a man is about being emotionally stoic, in control, strong. Can you see that tension? And that tension's worth naming. Because what I've observed in my work, hands-on, is that when opportunities are present to be vulnerable with each other, to be tender with each other, they are often masked or turned into jokes. Or an opportunity to insert banter. Really, this is avoidance. You've got men and boys that are desiring this space to be heard and to normalize emotional expression and to normalize, vulnerability as men. But also when that opportunity presents itself organically in spaces, when we're talking about feelings, when we're talking about how we feel in the space, when we're talking about some of our experiences as young men or their experiences as young men in the space, the opportunity to listen and to really hold that space is something that often isn't taken, even if it's there and if it organically presents itself in the room. This is important because there is a desire to be more emotionally open and vulnerable and to have spaces and peerships that are, again, rooted in that emotionality and that openness. But it goes back to that scripting. Being a man is about being emotionally stoic, strong. So there's this tension between what a man or a young man feels in themselves, congruently, authentically, and also what they feel they need to perform in spaces where eyes are on them. I've called this in my work duality strain in my book. That's something that I write about in my book. But for some of you that are more, in tune and in alignment with social psychology, that feels like, self-discrepancy theory as well, right? That sort of tension between who a person is and who they present as, looking glass self, etc., right? But that's really important to name. There is a desire to maybe break away from some of that man box conditioning when those ideas or those contexts present themselves. That cultural conditioning takes over. That's what we need to be conscious of naming and curiously exploring and intentionally exploring in work that we do with young men and masculinities around emotionality and how emotionality comes up and presents itself in the spaces that we're a part of. This leads me to my final point, because this is a longer episode, but hopefully there's some things for you to think about and consider as practitioners and educators or just people that are interested in this conversation in general. The last thing that I think is really important from an observation point for me that I want to bring into this episode is that there is a difference in terms of how young men and boys present themselves publicly and how they present themselves privately. Hive mind, social desirability bias, this sort of homosociality where it's kind of like, okay, we need to kind of conform to the group norm is very present and very palpable in the work that I do with young men and boys. You can have a really productive and expansive conversation around masculinity, men and boys, where ideas are challenged and vulnerability is brought forward, and there is a real sense of I've learned and unlearned something in the space. Yet when you present or observe boys in group settings where there's a lot of eyes and peer eyes specifically on them, the behavior changes. It shifts to what's expected versus what's congruent personally. This might seem commonsensical, but again, it's important to name and it's important to be intentional with when we work forwards coming into this academic year. Boys are evidencing this ability to be very open and honest about how they're feeling and the tensions that they feel and experience navigating school contexts as young men and community contexts as young men. Growing into a young man is very stressful because it's very confusing. What does it mean? What do I do? How do I present? What's the right way? What's not the right? There's a lot of pressure. But what I often see is the conformity or conforming towards the sort of rigid archetype more so than challenging, disrupting the status quo or the perceived status quo. This is important because this tension, what someone publicly performs and what someone privately thinks, might seem, oh, that's interesting and that's fascinating from like a social psychological perspective, which it can be. But when we're talking about things like harm culture, specifically misogyny and sexism, where in private you're condemning, but publicly you're enacting and enabling behavior that causes that harm, we need to be very intentional with how we name it and how we approach it. Because the difference between what's publicly performed and what's privately thought, what is publicly performed is causing harm. What's publicly performed is enabling harm to continue. And if we're not intentional with naming that discrepancy and curiously exploring that discrepancy, we are actively compounding the harm cultures we're looking to dismantle. So it's all well and good observing that tension, but how we name it and how we approach it moving forward is massively important. This is where, for me, the smaller group work is really useful because it takes the eyes, for lack of a better term, and the cultural pressure and the cultural expectancy. It reduces it. It reduces the need to be socially desirable and creates room to be more personally congruent and to change those behaviors and to create space for those behaviors to be, examined and explored. You have to be able to name it in a space where it feels safer to explore, to be challenged, and to really think about from different ideas and perspectives. Naming it in a big group is going to produce a group response. Naming it in smaller groups, you've got opportunities to share and think about your own experiences and how those experiences may have applied to you or maybe not applied to you as much in certain spaces is really important. Because what it then does is it enables boys to think about their public performance and their private thoughts and where that discrepancy might be. And that's something that I see a lot in the work that I do with young men and boys in the context of school and specifically in relation to masculinity work. So those are some of my thoughts. It's not my camera off there, but these are some of my thoughts, and there might be a part two because there are lots. There is like specific minutiae for me that I think are really important to talk about as well. But I'll be here for another 2 hours because there are some things about the assumptions we make about, for example, working class boys and the blanketization of working class boys that at times for me is really not productive in terms of how we approach working class boys needs in the context of schools. And it's also an assumption or a framework in around how we approach conversations around harm cultures, misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls, which I feel at times, even though the intention is productive and the intention is to really calibrate young people, what I'm seeing is an arrival into a space in a posture of defensiveness because young people are expecting to be shouted at and basically lectured for an hour about how terrible they are, when really what those spaces for me need to be are curiously attuned and culturally competent. But sometimes that gets lost in how ideas or external visitors or workshops and assemblies are described to young people, which creates this real tension. Oh, you're here to talk to us about how toxic we are or toxic masculinity, which is not, if you follow me, this is not a lens that I particularly use. So you can imagine my confusion at times. And again, to be really clear, this isn't about shading or throwing shade shots. This is a general theme that many of us in the space observe when we go into school spaces. Even when there's no prior communication, there is an assumption that somebody entering into the space to talk about masculinity is coming to tell off, shout at, or condemn boys. And I think we need to change that, not to sidestep the reality of harm cultures that we exist and persist within, but to recognize that to create fruitful learning opportunities, nervous systems have to be calibrated, nervous systems have to feel safe. There has to be this approach that is naming that tension, but also being really intentional of this is the space for you to curiously explore ideas of masculinity, not a space where you're talking about toxic masculinity. Because that, even though what the session might be and exploring, those themes might come up, how it's described and how it's frameworked is massively important when it comes to engagement and when it comes to participation. Those are some of my ideas, some of my perspectives on current context of masculinity in schools. I hope you found it useful. I hope that you found them, able for you to kind of reflect on, think about how you can approach it as educators in the space moving forwards. Thank you so much for checking in with the episode. A bit longer than normal, but I think it's important that we spend some time exploring it and expanding on those ideas. And if you have any other things that you want me to cover in future episodes, please do let me know. I'd be very interested in how I can kind of create content that serves you over the next few months. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate you. And I'll speak to you very, very soon. Big, big blessings. Bye bye.